All right, I'm really glad that we're all convened here for another workshop exploring the American system of economics, actually of political economy. Economics and politics should not be separated as they have been today. They are two sides of the same thing. You can't do much as far as political liberty or sovereignty is concerned if you don't actually have a grasp of economy, and you can't really do much economically if you don't have a grasp of politics and the political power structures. So in saner times, before most of us here were born, that was better understood. And there was a science of political economy that was existent. There was not necessarily an agreement on what it looked like or what its purpose should be. Some had said in the 19th century that the science of political economy should be premised around controlling populations and using the powers of government and the powers of the purse economically to keep a certain status quo, suppress the development of population, bodies of people coming into being, quality of life, the mental powers. These things should all be limited, because when you have too many people thinking too much, you have instability, which is troublesome for an elite. And then other people, as we've been exploring over the previous weeks, have had a very healthier version of that idea, which was that no, political economy as a science should be premised around increasing the quality of life, increasing the quantity and quality of people and the minds of those people coming into being with greater liberties for the individual, as well as for the nation, as well as for humanity as a whole. And maybe in so doing, the family and the brotherhood of humanity will be made healthier and more in alignment with natural law when we do that. Sounds utopic maybe today in our cynical age where we've seen a lot of corruption and lies, but this is actually the idea or the basis upon which any goodness has ever occurred for the past thousands of years. So whether people want to brush it off as being utopian or not does not make it less true or less valid. We've gone through 4 weeks of reading through Lincoln and Henry C. Carey especially. Today, we're going to begin to go a little bit before the time of Carey into somebody who set the foundation for Carey's work in the form of the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who is probably one of the most slandered, skewed characters of world history that I know of. There's been so much reframing of that period of history and of the person of Hamilton per se, who was killed in 1804 by, interestingly enough, the actual founder of the US deep state, Aaron Burr, who set up, everything we know is the cancer of Wall Street, was set up by none other than the guy who murdered Hamilton, Aaron Burr. And pretty much everything really bad and evil that has been done inside of the US by the US from that point onward can be rooted really to that moment of Aaron Burr's taking over a bank that was created by Hamilton, the Bank of New York, which was originally designed to be an instrument of growth and empowerment of labor and industry. And it was converted and transformed increasingly into a basket case called the Bank of Manhattan, which became, again, a speculative enterprise, a branch of the City of London within the United States. So before we get into Hamilton's actual writings, Pascal had suggested that we take a little journey through the mind of a modern Hamiltonian, somebody who had recently passed away in 2019, who has greatly inspired my work. Pascal, Cynthia, many of us have had a chance to read, to be influenced by, and to research the mind, the discoveries, and the work of Lyndon LaRouche, who wrote a piece in 1987 called In Defense of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. So we're going to read maybe not the whole thing today, but we'll try. We'll see how far it goes. It's a bit of a dense paper, so we'll stop and ask questions if need be, and make sure everyone's following the thread of the thought. But this is not what you might think. The science of economy and specifically the science of the American system, although people try to sometimes say, well, what are the mechanisms? Is it just the national bank? Is it just protectionism? Is it just is the emphasis on industrial growth? Which is it one of these or all of these mechanisms that define the American system? And that's the wrong question. Those are attributes that you may find within it, but that is not the American system. In the same way that when you ask, like, well, what makes a good soldier? What makes a good, let's say a warrior, philosophically, is it having a sword? Is it having their shield? Is it having a good helmet? It's like, no, these are attributes, which obviously it makes it easier to do battle when you have a shield or some armor or a helmet or a sword, sure. But that's not what makes a good versus a bad soldier. You have to look into something deeper, a little bit more metaphysical, as far as the psycho-spiritual attributes, right, of the person. Are you using your power, your sword, to suppress, or are you doing it to defend? Are you doing it for justice, or are you doing it for something egotistical, right? What's your motive? And that's what we're going to see increasingly when we explore LaRouche's understanding of the American system, and specifically, again, the science of economy. So, Pascal, am I missing anything before we jump in, or is that adequate, you think?
I think it's good. I mean, I would rather intervene maybe during the reading if I have anything to say, but I think we should just jump in and get people to be acquainted with LaRouche. Yeah.
All right. Good. Okay. Looking for here it is. Okay. Can people see that page here? Yeah. Okay. So we'll see how far we can get. We'll need maybe one or two readers today. Vince, you wanna start the reading, or you want?
I could read, but you got to make it bigger for me.
Oh, let me see what I can do. Are you on like a cell phone or something?
No, I'm on my laptop. If I turn like this, then I could read it easier.
Okay. How's this?
Yeah, let me see if I can do it. I don't know, you guys. I'm losing my eyes as I get older.
Oh man, well, we can get somebody else. It's okay.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pass today. It is.
Don't worry.
I really don't want to put them glasses on if I don't have to.
All's good, man. All right. So do we have another volunteer?
I can.
That is
All right. So,
okay, Declan, we're going to do a little test here. Count to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay. Was that quality of sound good for everybody else? All right. You're on.
All right. Let's see. In defense of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton by Lyndon H. LaRouche Jr. Note, Lyndon LaRouche was running for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1987 at the time he wrote this paper. A version of this paper was issued by the LaRouche Democratic Campaign, and another as follows was published in the July 3rd, 1987 EIR. So June 22nd, 1987. Today, Alexander Hamilton, our Republic's first Treasury Secretary and Inspector General of our armed forces, seems to be a giant, and our contemporary political leaders, the Lilliputians by comparison. What exactly is a Lilliputian?
That comes from Jonathan Swift's The Gulliver's Travel.
Oh, okay.
It's the little people, right?
Very tiny. Yeah.
All right, that makes sense. When Hamilton entered the post of Treasury Secretary, our nation's indebtedness and economy were in a terrible condition, similar in many ways to the economic disaster we are suffering today. Under Hamilton's program of recovery, our national credit was restored, our banking system became the soundest in the world, and prosperous growth was unleashed throughout most of our nation. These policies of credit, banking, and economy, which Hamilton outlined in his famous report to Congress, became admired and envied worldwide by the name of the American system of political economy. Under the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Treasury Secretary Gallatin scrapped the American system and introduced Adam Smith's free trade dogmas instead. The result of this change was a ruinous one. Under Presidents James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, Adam Smith's ruinous ideas were scrapped. Hamilton's American system was restored. National credit, banking, and economy were saved. Presidents Jackson and Van Buren destroyed the American system and reintroduced the ruinous policies of Adam Smith. The result of Jackson's policies was the terrible panic of 1837. I have lived personally through a similar experience in my own lifetime. The Coolidge and Hoover use of Adam Smith's policies during the 1920s plunged the world into a Great Depression. Most Americans suffered greatly throughout 1938, until President Franklin Roosevelt began his first steps towards preparing us for the war with Hitler he already knew then was inevitable. Many of you are told today that it was military spending that pulled the United States out of the Depression. I was there and saw, as did many of my generation, exactly how the economic recovery of 1940 to 42 was organized. It was not the war which caused the economic recovery. President Roosevelt created the economic recovery to bring the production of our farms and industries up to levels needed to support our mobilization for war. It was not the war which caused the economic recovery. It was the economic recovery which made it possible for us and our allies to win the war. We could have had an even better economic recovery if we had not been forced to do this under the costly inflationary conditions of war. Despite the inflationary costs of full-scale war, the U.S. recovery of 1940-43 was one of the greatest successes in economic history of the world. All the prosperity we enjoyed during the 20 years after the war was the result of the high levels of farming and industrial potential we built up by 1943. During the past 20 years, under 5 successive presidents, our economy has been sliding downhill. Today, most of our families, local communities, farms, and industries, things are as bad or worse than during the middle of the 1930s. Leading world bankers are warning us that we are near the edge of the biggest financial crash in history. The time has come to junk Adam Smith's ruinous policy of free trade and to return our country to what Secretary Hamilton was first to name the American system of political economy. That is what I intend to do as your next elected president of the United States. Today, more and more political analysts are warning that the AIDS issue will make my presidential candidacy a very strong proposition. When some among these analysts are asked what might be the added effect of the financial crash becoming an issue during the coming months, their eyes roll upward as if they were about to faint. The response is, let us hope that the crash can be postponed till after the 1988 elections. For technical reasons, the only one who could predict the exact timing of a crash is some powerful government or banking interest, which knew the day on which it intended to pull the plug. Unless one has that sort of information, it is impossible to predict mathematically the exact timing of a financial crisis. However, the international financial bubble is now stretched to the point it is ready to burst. Under these conditions, any significant disturbance could set off a chain reaction collapse in markets. Anyone who imagines that it could be postponed to beyond President Reagan's January 1989 farewell address to the nation, without the kinds of sweeping changes in emergency policy I would propose, is dreaming wishful dreams.
I'm going to just stop you right there for a brief moment, because that might have confused a couple of people who are wondering why it was that we didn't experience a systemic crash as he had pointed out, it would happen before Reagan's 89 farewell address to the nation, right? He's writing this in June 1987.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, yeah, I put something in the chat.
you did.
I did post a little bit of just to give people a chronological idea of the presidency and the different reports that Hamilton wrote. And also the last one I put was on Black Monday. I don't know. I think that's kind of where you were going.
You got it. Yeah, very good. Yeah, very important. So Pascal just included here this information, a very useful timeline of presidents and publications. But here, Black Monday, October 19th, 1987, Wikipedia says Black Monday is the name commonly given to the global, sudden, severe, and largely unexpected stock market crash on October 19th, 1987, several months after LaRouche wrote that, where this is where the stock markets lost 25% of their value overnight and had to be pretty much shut down for a sustained period. And emergency sessions under Alan Greenspan and other central bankers were convened to try to figure out how to stop another global depression from sweeping the world. And do people know how they resolved that? Because they could have followed what LaRouche was saying. They could have done the right thing. And however, instead of going for a real, New Deal FDR style recovery and remediation of the problems, what they did instead is unveiled Greenspan's creative financial instruments. So they pretty much said, well, let's create and normalize or even more. Because you would have gone to jail for doing junk bond trading or derivative speculation before that. However, after that moment, that became a new norm of practice, where derivatives, the creation of fictitious speculative capital, began to grow like a cancer at a rate never before seen before. So they sort of kicked the can down the lane a little bit, but it just made the bubble that much bigger. And so here we are now, 30 years later.
Hey, Matt, is that the 25% of our economy that was created as just this financial speculative arm of our economy for the last, basically since then, if this was the beginning of it, you're saying?
That's the beginning of it. And today, by 1992, derivatives were $2 trillion. By 1999, they were $70 trillion. By 2007, they were about $780 trillion. And today it's about 1.2 to 2 quadrillion dollars worth of derivatives, nominal assets, which compared to the overall global GDP, which is about 80 trillion, it's like a 20-fold overvaluation of the system. So it's way more than 25%.
It kind of reminds me of like 2008 was kind of like, I guess, one of those a result of that.
Yeah.
In that it was just chaos and all these derivatives that weren't worth anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They called it the wall of money. Greenspan's wall of money.
So blatant.
Bailout, basically bailout,
Yeah, right.
I remember in the 80s, that's when they came out with the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, that was part of it as well. Yeah, the euro and the NAFTA were both parts of this operation.
Yeah, I remember when they did that, a lot of businesses started, in Canada here, they started disappearing around that time.
Millions of productive enterprises were destroyed. That's right. Yeah. So let's get back on track and follow this line of thought.
All right. Therefore, any American who is looking for a few months or more ahead ought to be very.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Therefore, you're totally right. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Ought to be very concerned with knowing my economic philosophy and plans for emergency action. My policies are documented at considerable length in a number of published texts, including a special report I presented to the Reagan administration in August 1982, and a follow-up special report submitted a year later. Given the reading habits of most of my fellow citizens today, it is indispensable that I summarize this topic in a series of shorter articles. In this article, I concentrate on what might be the first question which comes to the mind of the concerned citizen. What is the kernel of my philosophy of economics? By profession, I am primarily an economist, and by scientific standards, a very successful one. All my work in this field lies within the policy framework of the American system, as defined by such leading economists as Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, the two Careys, and Friedrich List. Within that context, I have added an important discovery. My discovery, known around the world today as the Larouche-Riemann method, does not overturn anything proposed by Hamilton's famous 1791 report on the subjects of manufacturers, but only strengthens Hamilton's policies rather significantly. Within Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacturers, the following passage appears prominently. To cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. The connection between inventions of the mind and the increase of the physical productive powers of labor is the kernel of the American system. What I have accomplished is to show that it is possible to predict mathematically the rate of increased physical economic growth, which will result from an effective use of a specific sort of mental production of a new technology. On this basis, I have been able to provide a new, stronger scientific proof for the reasons that Hamilton's American system promotes depression-free economic growth, and why Adam Smith's doctrine must always lead a nation to new disasters. Most of the argument in the following pages belongs within the scope of what most readers would probably call intelligent common sense. Part is somewhat technical, although I am able to describe this in terms which require no mathematics education beyond the high school level. I make no apologies for including this technical material. Contrary to the apparent beliefs of President Ronald Reagan, economics is a science which only bunglers would approach with nothing more than a few handy slogans. By the end of this article, the reader will recognize the practical importance of the technical matters I introduce in the following section. All right.
All right.
So, the core of my argument. The fault of most modern economists and our government officials reporting on the economy is that these fellows simply do not know what it is they ought to be measuring. Certain things have been growing in our economy. Some things have not been growing, such as farming, industry, stability of banks, and the average standard of living of family households. That which pleases the Reagan administration, it measures. That which does not please the administration, it either does not measure at all or measures in an incompetent way. As a result, while the economy has been collapsing, the administration has been reporting economic growth. Hoover promised a chicken in every pot, but ignored the question, how many Americans will still be able to afford a pot? What is it that we should measure? I summarize the most fundamental features of the problem. Modern anthropologists insist that the earliest form of society was what they term a hunting and gathering society, in which mankind's existence depends upon hunting fish and animals or gathering wild fruits and vegetables. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that these anthropologists were correct. Look at such a society through the eyes of the economist. The average of approximately 10 square kilometers of the Earth's land area would be needed to sustain the nutrition of the average individual in such a society. This would mean that the human population worldwide could not have succeeded above 10 million individuals. It would be a very miserable existence. The average life expectancy would be well below 20 years of age, and cultural level a brutish one. Over a period longer than the past 2,000 years, we have fairly good knowledge of the population densities and technologies used in major portions of the world. Our knowledge became more precise since the great census taken by Charlemagne, especially in Western Europe, where church statistics are most helpful in enabling us to estimate population densities by area with considerable precision. Since the 15th century, the quality of our data is highly reliable for estimating the rates of change in population densities. For our purposes here, it is not necessary for me to go into detail on the kinds of methods we use to estimate populations and to cross-check those estimates. The point I am making is a fairly obvious one, a very crucial difference between the behavior of mankind and beasts, as seen through the eyes of the economist. Today, there are more than 5 billion persons. Even with existing technologies, as in the case of Belgium illustrates the general point, we could sustain 3 or more times the present levels of population at a standard of living compared to that of Western Europe and North America during the happier days of the early 1970s. In other words, since the hunting and gathering society, we have increased mankind's potential population by about 1,000 times. We have also increased potential life expectancies by about 4 times. If we measure all forms of income in kilocalories consumed, we have raised the potential standard of living by much more than 1,000 times. In mathematics, it is conventional to speak of an increase by a factor of 10 as an increase of 1 order of magnitude. Through technological progress, mankind has increased its potential by about 3 orders of magnitude. The smartest species of beast could not increase its potential population density by even a significant fraction of 1 order of magnitude. From the standpoint of the economist, the thing about human existence which sets us above the beasts is that we are able to effect successive advances in what we call scientific and technological knowledge, and are able to transmit that knowledge to one another in such a way as to raise the standard of living of the average person, while also increasing the potential size of the human population sustained at this improved level. No beast's mind can generate or transmit scientific and technological progress. The most important fact in economic history is society's power to increase productivity through generating technological progress and assimilating these technological advances into daily practice of society generally. Let us set up a very crude sort of equation which expresses what we have just said, y equals f of x, in which y signifies a rate of increase in productivity and x signifies the rate of increase of technological progress. F of x signifies a function expressed in terms of rate of increase of technological progress. Is it possible to construct a mathematical function for the required form? The search for such a mathematical economics function has been ongoing since the founding of modern economic science by Gottfried Leibniz during his work over the period 1672 to 1716.
So just so we know, our plan is after we continue our work on Alexander Hamilton, will be to revisit something more thorough by Mr. LaRouche, written in the early 1990s, that goes much more in depth into economics as a science, which was a specific breakthrough he made. And Pascal, in the chat box, which will also be in the description box of this video, included a link to a paper which is rather important to look through. It's called On LaRouche's Ninth Forecast, going through the 9 recorded forecasts made by Mr. LaRouche since the 1960s, which he was successful on, and for certain specific reasons that had to do a lot with what he was looking at when he was talking about economics, which other economists were not, which is eminently accessible to the mind of anybody with common sense, as he points out. You don't need a PhD to look at these things and understand them. So that's an important thing to review. And don't get intimidated by things like y equals, like measuring the rate of increase of technological progress. These are things that will be fleshed out more and more as we proceed onward.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the the link that I gave is it's a 1-pager. It's a very easy summary of the 9 forecasts. So it's not a full paper by LaRouche. It's only the 1-pager.
Oh, okay, that's good. All right, good. Cliff's notes.
All right. So what Leibniz did in this connection was to establish economic science as a branch of physical science. This economic science was known during the 18th century into the 19th century as the science of physical economy. It was sometimes also identified by other terms, including science of technology and, in French, polytechnique. This branch of economics, physical economy, is the area within which the greatest part of my own professional work lies. A mathematical economics function of this sort is possible. There we go. My principal contribution to economic science, such as my initial discoveries during 1952, has been to show how such a function must be defined. This mathematical function cannot be solved through the use of methods upon which present-day econometric forecasting is based. Those methods are based on the combined influence of several influential figures of the 1930s and 40s. Harvard's Professor Wassily Leontief, the principal designer of the present U.S. national income accounting system, Professor John von Neumann, and Professor Norbert Weiner's doctrine of information theory. These defective methods are known among specialists as methods of solution of simultaneous linear inequalities. No system of linear inequalities can represent the relationship between rates of advance in technology and rates of increase in physical productivity. What I did, starting by attacking this fallacy in the arguments of Leontief, von Neumann, and Weiner, was to return to the starting point of my adolescent studies of Leibniz's work. On that basis, over the course of several years' work, I redefined the problem. My next difficulty was to select a choice of mathematics suited for solving problems of the type I had defined. I found the solution in the work of a leading 19th century physicist, Professor Bernard Riemann. For that reason, my discovery is known as the Larouche-Riemann method. The first crucial problem we encounter in seeking to construct the desired kind of mathematical function is the problem of defining what we should mean by human creativity in mathematical language. Creation is a conception which cannot be represented in any system of deductive mathematics. My adolescence wrestling with the famous critiques of Immanuel Kant enabled me to understand this problem, where Leontief, von Neumann, and Weiner, among others, have failed to do so. Define the word creation. Try it in theology. Try it in cosmology. What do you mean by the word? Most of you mean that in one moment something does not exist, but in the next moment it does. The transition from the first to second moment you will name creation. What happens in between those two moments, which causes the new thing to be created? No matter how long you attack that question with the methods of formal, Aristotelian logic, or modern deductive mathematics, you will end up no better at the beginning than at the beginning. To the person who relies only upon deductive logic, it will seem that creation is a word we use to identify something that the human mind could never grasp. That was the argument of Immanuel Kant throughout his critiques. Kant insisted throughout these critiques, but especially in his last, his Critique of Judgment, that the mental process by which human beings create a valid scientific theory are not intelligible. This was the same standpoint which von Neumann took, not only in his doctrines on mathematical economics, but as mathematical theory generally. This was Norbert Weiner's standpoint in information theory. The solution to this problem of mathematics was first shown to exist by a person who was probably the greatest genius of the past 600 years, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. In addition to being the papacy's outstanding thinker of the Italian Renaissance period, Cusa was the founder of the methods of modern physical science, and the most direct influence on the work of Leonardo da Vinci, Johannes Kepler, among others, as well as a leading indirect influence on oh my gosh, what is that? How do you pronounce that?
Huygens. Christian Huygens.
Huygens, okay.
Yeah.
Huygens
discovered the wave function of light.
Oh. Huygens and Leibniz, among others. Cusa shows how creation could be represented as an intelligible idea, capable of mathematical representation. Cusa was the founder of one of the two leading branches of modern physical science. Galileo, Descartes, and Newton are typical of the methods of formal deduction based upon Euclid's elements. Cusa, Leonardo, Kepler, Leibniz, Gauss, and Riemann are among the leading names in an opposing faction in science, whose method is based on non-Euclidean geometry. By non-Euclidean geometry, I mean one based entirely on construction, with no axioms, from which use of deductive reasoning is prohibited.
People can stop and ask a question if you feel one pressing at any time.
All right. I know that axioms are just things we assume in geometry.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's two categories of axioms going forward, because you have those that you just assume blindly, and then you have those that you think about and demonstrate with your reason to be true. So assumptions that are blind versus assumptions that are provable, and then they stop really being assumptions at that point, don't they? They sort of become knowledge. So
yeah,
that's sort of how you
like.
Mhm.
Yeah, like the first thing you assume in geometry is that and you can always draw a line between any 2 points. So that's pretty obvious. But then you go later and you find out like the parallel axiom, where you're talking about parallel lines, and non-Euclidean geometry changes those axioms around and makes whole new weird geometry stuff that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the problem when people believe blindly in Euclid, they end up not questioning some of these underlying assumptions that presume that the universe is like this linear, infinitely extended, boring place where everything is equal and you could have two lines going parallel forever. But in reality, as we discover, the physical universe with physical space-time as it is not like that. It's not so linear at all. And if you apply any shape to space, you start realizing that breaks down pretty quickly, as we could see, like when you have the parallel postulate on a sphere, right, where the line would no longer be a line, but it would be, let's say, a circumference of the sphere. And all of a sudden you launch two lines at 90-degree angles from the circumference of that sphere, and no longer do they just walk parallel side by side forever, but they end up converging at the top pole of the sphere. So and that's just a simple sphere. There's so many, like you pointed out, the shape of space can get kind of interesting and complex when you look at it in a Gaussian way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
used to have a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
just 30 seconds in defense of Euclid. Okay. An axiom is a rule of a game. And when you try to explain it, it's no longer an axiom, it's a theorem. So the problem is, once again, the people who tend to admire too much the creators of certain game, of certain theories, okay? Because the axiom just say that we start with those rules, and starting with those rules, we arrive at a certain set of consequences. But it's not forbidden to create new rules, okay? It's not written in the Elements by Euclid that it is absolutely forbidden to create new rules if you have the brain for that. So 30 seconds of defense of creators, and Euclid was a creator, and I insist he never wrote in his introduction that it's forbidden to create new axioms.
He never wrote that it is forbidden to create new axioms. That is true. That is true.
Okay, so I think that, well, once again, we at the core of that, okay, meaning the human mind and the human creativity, and great men can do much harm because they impress people so much that people tend to believe what they say as absolute reality and not only certain rules for a certain game.
So the thing to hold in mind now is what Quan just said is very important, that we have certain systems that have root assumptions, root axioms that flow through every branch that unfolds within the system, that are used in science and economy to explain measurable facts that we can bring in and then use to shape our decision making for the future. What LaRouche is identifying are two opposing currents that are not compatible, although they're attempting to explain and direct a similar type of a process, which coexist in space and time over the years, over the centuries and millennia. And one, he's rooted in the mode of thinking and method of thinking expressed by those, like he brings up Bernard Riemann, Nicholas of Cusa, Leibniz is a key one, there's many other key figures, Huygens, and he situates that in a different current with a different methodology of thinking, as we see with a list of some names like Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Kant, that he situates in a different school, a different current. So it's just good to have that as a thumbnail sketch in the mind. We can probe and penetrate what those differences are at greater detail going forward, but just hold that in the mind.
Yes.
All right.
I got a question about Lyndon LaRouche. Like, is he like a politician, philosopher? Like, what's his? I don't really know much about him.
Yeah, don't worry about it too much right now. I'll send you a little bio. I did a eulogy when he died. I wrote it up for Strategic Culture, and I'll send you that. But yeah, he's those things, and as he describes himself as somebody who pioneered a way of thinking in physical economy, which is quite important. He ran for the presidency like 9 times. I think he's the world record for that, and he wore a lot of hats. But you'll see in the eulogy I wrote, I go through quite a bit.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
All right. So without going into the detailed history of this scientific issue, it is enough to say that the following. Cusa solved the problem left unsolved by Archimedes, the so-called problem of showing why the attempt at a simple squaring of a circle is based upon a mistaken assumption. Cusa discovered a geometrical and physical principle, which he defined as the maximum minimum principle, which modern mathematicians know as in the guise of the parametric theorem of geometric topology. The greatest advance beyond Cusa's original formulation was contributed by Carl Gauss. A number of Gauss's contemporaries and collaborators worked on refining Gauss's discovery. The results of this were summed up in the work of Riemann. Today, we call the variety of mathematical physics based on Gauss's approach to constructive geometry the Gauss-Riemann complex domain. Riemannian physics is based centrally on the mathematical representation of processes which evolve to higher states. This is the only branch of mathematical physics in which it is possible to account for what occurs during that interval, constituting the act of creation between the two moments of successive not being and being. This is not the place to elaborate the significance of Riemann's surface functions. Our purpose here is simply to identify the nature of the problem of representation and the location on which the required form of mathematical solution is to be found. The following points must, however, be made.
I'm sorry, just quick, hold in mind as well, people. And again, this is something worth going back to many times. Don't think this is the only time you're going to read it and you should understand everything. Don't stress about that, okay? Brief concept, very important. We're talking about systems, both economic systems, as well as all systems, systems of nature, systems of the fabric of space-time, of galaxies, of everything. So what is a method of thinking about systems fruitfully and unfruitfully? Because inside of a system, there's certain rules that are bounded by certain principles that shape the behavior of the elements within a system, right? Whether it's an ecosystem, a human economy, there's certain rules shaped by certain constraints, right? Certain limitations, certain physical properties that behave the flow and the motion, the creation of actions within that system. So what are those principles? How do we come to know that invisible contour that shapes the behavior of action within a system? And as he says, how do we appreciate the qualitative improvements of that system as it goes from one lower state to a higher state, allowing a greater degree of action, of freedom, right? That would allow for that. What allows for that transformation? Is it something linear, or is it something that is a creative leap? If it's a creative leap, is it intelligible, or is it mystical?
Yeah.
Right. These are the ideas.
Maybe I would like to add something to that. Going back to the paragraph speaking of the attempt at the simple squaring of the circle, okay, is based upon a mistaken assumption. Okay, it's about the mechanism of the mind. Okay, we are speaking of two lineages, the lineages of deductive logic and the lineages of constructive geometry. All right. So the lineage of the deductive logic is more about one of the major functions of the mind, which is verbal concepts. And the other lineage is more about constructive geometry, or anything by construction. Right? And that famous isoperimetric theorem has been solved not by using mental conceptual solutions, meaning by giving axioms, meaning rules of the game, and assuming consequences from those primary rules, but rather by geometric construction. And that theorem states that on a surface, if you have a circle with a certain diameter, the surface given by that circle is the maximum possible. Okay, so the solution to the problem of the squaring of the circle, that in French they call la quadrature du cercle, meaning what would be the surface of the square equivalent to the surface of a circle having x radius or x diameter. Okay, it's not possible to solve that problem by conceptual analysis. You have to make a construction. Okay, so once again, I repeat, some great men prefer to use verbal concepts, or the great men prefer to use constructive geometry. It doesn't mean that one group is bad and the other is good. You have to use your brain to choose what is the appropriate tool for a specific situation and how to combine the different functions of the mind to solve a specific problem.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And it's good to keep in mind that unlike some of the other characters in the play that are being introduced, Archimedes in no way plays a negative role in anything. One could not make the argument that he had a negative effect on the creative development of humankind's knowledge. He made so many discoveries and did so much good. But LaRouche, in this particular instance, is simply saying that there was certain assumptions that he was not able to let go of, which prevented his reconciliation of the linear and the curved.
Yes.
Right.
The great Archimedes had his own obsessions. Okay, he was human after all.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so where were we? If you imagine that the only self-evident form of action in the universe were a circular action, as Cusa showed, then all the true theorems and constructions in Euclidean geometry can be developed in a non-deductive, non-Euclidean way by construction. This is done first by imagining the case in which circular action is acting upon circular action, as if the one is at right angles to another, and that this is occurring at every interval of each circular action. This is called doubly connected circular action. Euclidean space, elaborated by rigorous methods of non-deductive, non-Euclidean construction, is essentially triply connected. With Gauss, we go a step further. We know
By the way, when he says triply connected here for Euclidean space, I think he's really, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's just referring here to the idea of an X, Y, Z axis, that you can go that direction, or that direction. But there's not really much else you can do as far as qualities of action are concerned as fundamental. Whereas he's saying it's preferable to start, instead of linear action, linear directionality, from a point outward, to instead begin from the standpoint of a rotational curved action, and then adding curved on curved actions and building up a system that accounts for the same phenomenon, but with very different concepts qualitatively defining how you come to know and characterize concepts we're evaluating, that are empirical within those two opposing systems.
So am I supposed to think of like polar coordinates versus rectangular coordinates at this point?
When you say a polar coordinate, what are you referring to?
When it's in like trigonometry, where you use angles and stuff to graph instead of a
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, but
angles and curves.
Declan, what you are referring to, they are both in the Euclidean system. It's two different ways to operate into the Euclidean system.
Well, when you look at trigonometry, I would say if you're doing it from a pure standpoint without any assumptions of linearity as a primary function, but you're looking at the behavior of curved functions on the side of a circle, since all trigonometry comes from the investigation of actions within a circle, right? And the relationships that occur regarding the diagonal, the radius, and other relationships that are all contained within a circle. You can build up all trigonometry from that standpoint. Yeah, it's a different universe, but you can also carry in a Euclidean could carry in all of these linear assumptions into something which is fundamentally nonlinear too, and understand something very different when they're looking at a circle as something which is made of an infinite amount of points around a center point, for example. They might think that, but not realize that that's actually impossible.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you know why it would be impossible that a circle could be characterized as being an infinite array of points separated by the same distance around a center?
Well, because that would be impossible to measure. You couldn't get points like that. I mean, physically.
How do you know?
Thing.
Why not?
Well, because each point would have to be equal to 0, basically. It would have to be nothing.
This kid's great.
Essentially.
Declan, that's amazing. Exactly. Euclid defines a point as being that which has no width, breadth, or height. Thus, it is nothing. And to add a bunch of nothings together still gives you nothing. So, Declan, amazing. Great answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I always liked his definitions of undefined terms in the very beginning. That which has no, which is not, and stuff like that. It's really funny. Euclid.
Sorry to be a little bit obsessed on that again. A definition is within a certain context. Okay, it's aware that we have to make the distinction between logic, which is mechanical, follows a certain number of rules, and common sense, which is superior to logic. Okay, that who is making the definition and for whom, in what context, and for what purpose. So I think that the problem of stupid logic, okay, versus common sense logic, is that the context is not taken into account in stupid or mechanical logic. And that is all the difference. And let's not forget that once again, the poor Aristotle named all his works about logic, and it shows that he was not so idiot than that. Okay, the name for all his works on logic is organon. Okay, organon in Greek means tools. Okay, so that tools can be useful in a certain context, and it's for the human brain with its common sense to decide if that tool is appropriate for that context and for that problem.
Could you say why you chose to, like, what are you speaking to at the moment in you having said and elaborated upon those points just now?
Yes, because of the excellent answer that Declan gave on the point having 0 dimension, okay? That is a arbitrary definition, which is a rule of the game. And that rule has been given for a certain purpose in a specific context. And that's what I call mechanical logic. And there's nothing wrong with mechanical logic if you maintain your common sense. The common sense being bigger and superior to mechanical logic, okay? And that's why I want to say that organon in Greek means tools, because I'm a little bit pedantic, of course, but it's also because a tool has to be chosen by someone having common sense, because the tool is for a specific task in a specific context. And if you use a tool that is not appropriate, it's not the fault of the tool, it's your fault.
Good point.
Okay.
I forget where we were.
We were after triply connected.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. With Gauss, we go a step further. We know that simply circular action is not an adequate representation of the real universe. Imagine a special form of circular action in which the radius of rotation is lengthening as the action occurs, spiral action. Now imagine that the center of the rotation is moving forward in the direction of time when this is occurring. Our spiral action now lies on the exterior surface of a cone. This is called a self-similar spiral for obvious reasons. Now, in place of circular forms of multiply connected action, substitute multiply connected similar spiral action.
Just
Trying
quick,
to-
Pascal, in the links that you just shared, did you have any diagrams featuring this stuff or no?
No, that was just for the two ones I gave there. It was for the squaring of the circle,
Okay.
some images. Yeah.
So what we can do afterwards, I'll try to find a few images tonight before we're done, or if not, next week when we meet up again, we can revisit and show some images and maybe some videos of what this sort of thing actually looks like.
Okay. State what you have done in the language of trigonometry using elliptic, hyperbolic, and hyperspherical trigonometric functions to accomplish this result. The result is the Gaussian form of the complex domain. It is the Riemannian form of this Gaussian complex domain which permits us to represent those kinds of processes which are properly called creative. Although this Riemannian approach is implicitly permits us to map brain functions in a broad way, the Larouche-Riemann method considers only one aspect of these brain functions, the problem with representing the generation of higher order technologies. Admittedly, at first glance, what we are able to accomplish in this way is mind-boggling, but after becoming used to the ideas involved, it all seems quite obvious. Beginning with a set of 3 scientific principles, which Riemann composed during 1853, as the dissertations qualifying him for the inauguration as professor at Gauss's Göttingen University. The central feature of Riemann's work as a whole is his concentration on the hypothesis that any physical process in the universe was mathematically representable in the Gaussian complex domain. Riemann supplied only partial proofs for this, but he made substantial advances and pointed the way in the direction in which more general proofs might be developed. What he did accomplish is more than sufficient for the needs of the economist. By the way, that whole thing about the 1853, that was making me think of like Gödel and von Neumann and the whole incompleteness theorem, where they were weren't they trying to explain the world by math then? Trying to boil everything down to a formula?
Yeah, very good.
And
Yeah,
how
that's
is
right.
this different?
It's a very similar principle of dispute between Gödel and Russell, and also Wiener, who was brought up at the beginning of this particular paper, because Norbert Wiener was a student of Bertrand Russell, right? And he was sort of carrying out, with his development of systems analysis and information theory, a challenge that was put forth by Russell and obeyed the Principia Mathematica goals of trying to express the entire universe in symbolic logic, linear symbolic logic. And that would basically assume that the universe is a closed linear system that could be known through deduction and induction, machine thinking basically, which has no real place for creative change. And he basically, Norbert Wiener, honed that and made that closed system thinking the language that was then used by all major government and political institutions inside the United States, increasingly in Russia after the death of Stalin, in the OECD and NATO. So that's where LaRouche was saying this language itself, which has certain assumptions about what the invisible contours and context of an economic system are what the problem is, located in Wiener. And when people look at what Kurt Gödel was doing to elegantly undermine that entire way of thinking by demonstrating that there is no such thing as a closed system, which is possible because there's always something outside of a closed system that defines the system that you're trying to look at. And he did it in some playful ways. It breaks it, which is what Bernard Riemann and Gauss were all also doing in their own way, by demonstrating that you could always use the mind when you're animated also by a factor of creative imagination and something else, to go beyond the limitations of deductive inductive logic and look at and appreciate with more refinement the invisible but knowable geometries that shape the world we're trying to map out and participate in, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one word on Gödel too, okay? Because when I said that there are two lineages of thinking with verbal concepts and with construction, okay? Gödel put an end, if you want, not an end, but show the limits of one of the two lineages, because he proved that precisely. Matthew gave it in general words, but the technical words are that there are limits to the provability of theoretical axiomatic theories, okay? Meaning that those are fancy words just to say that you need creation to go beyond a certain limit, okay? Because if you put a certain rules of the games at the beginning, those rules will give you a certain amount of results, what could be very interesting, but it will churn out a certain number of things, but after a certain amount of things, those rules will stop to churn out supplementary things, okay? So you would have to create another game.
Yep.
Wow, it lasted 20 centuries. It's not so bad after all.
Which game lasted 20 centuries? The Euclidean game, or?
Exactly, before someone gave the absolute proof that it reached to its limits.
Yeah, but in the same measure, one could also say, well, if you didn't have this damn oligarchical epistemological warfare ongoing throughout that time, artificially suppressing and handicapping the creative momentum of society and promoting instead a different way of thinking, maybe these discoveries could have happened a lot sooner without waiting too
once again, I am defending the own Euclid. He did not write in his introduction that it's forbidden to create new games. I think that we have to distinguish between the guy who created the first game and the politicians who use that for their own benefits. Okay?
I don't know Euclid. I don't know Euclid the man. All I'm saying is there were agencies that could have used the guy. Exactly.
He created a game, and his game was limited, and there were agencies, people promoting that game because they knew that that game probably could not be so creative in the long term. But that's political. It has nothing to do with the game.
Well, I have never had it proven to me that he was knowably a part of that bad game or not. I don't know.
He died long ago.
He died long ago. I don't know.
He died two millennia ago. And there were people who precluded new games to appear, that I agree. But the poor guy was dead. How could he participate in shenanigans 5 centuries after his death? Let's be serious.
The best you'll get out of me is maybe he was in on it, maybe he wasn't. I don't know.
Maybe what?
I said the best you'll get out of me is maybe he was in on it and maybe he wasn't. I don't know.
Well, I think the answer to that question is to be found And who were the greatest scientists before Euclid and what happened afterward? Because Bernard Riemann is in his habilitation dissertation in 1854
Yeah.
said that from Euclid to Lagrange, basically geometry and mathematics was basically in the dark age. Nothing really was proposed that made it evolve more than what Euclid, what from the standpoint of the Euclidean system.
Yeah. Lagrange was the guy
that knew better.
Yeah. Lagrange, was he the guy who put Euclidean geometry in algebra?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about Lagrange. I know that's what Riemann says. I'm not too I don't know. I know more d'Alembert.
Well, I would say the guy created something who was not all encompassing, obviously. And his system has been used by people having political power for their own advantages, okay? I think we have to distinguish the two.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
I'm gonna wait for the movie to come out.
What's that, Kelly?
I'm gonna wait for the movie to come out.
All right. Good move, Kelly. All right.
All right. Referring to the function y equals f of x, our first problem is that of defining the way in which both y, a rate of increase of productivity, and x, a rate of increase of technological progress, must be measured. The problem of defining y is the simplest part of the task. Defining x is the major challenge. It is that major challenge we are addressing at this point. If we can represent efficiently any physical process which represents a new technology, part of the problem of defining x is already solved. If we can also define which kinds of physical processes are more advanced, and show that in the same way we represent particular physical processes, we can measure with process which process is the more advanced technology. We can also measure how much more advanced it is. How do we compare two physical processes and say that one is measurably superior economically to another?
Okay, key question. He's going to answer this, but just really hold that question in the mind. How can you compare two different processes, not things, but processes, and judge one as being better or worse than the other? Key, right?
So is this like the free market versus the American system? We're proving it mathematically.
It's one of many examples one could do to, yeah, sure. You could think of it that way if you want to.
All right. Yeah, I was thinking that as an example of like those are two systems, and he's going on to prove them mathematically, not just like through reasoning.
Yeah, and the British system of Adam Smith and all of his heirs, which form the basis of the entirety of globalization as we have known it to destroy the world, is all rooted in Newtonian assumptions. That's clear and admitted by all of even the establishment British thinkers, that Newtonian assumptions are at the heart and soul of the Adam Smith structure and assumptions of what a system is and what human beings are moving within it, where value comes from, all of that. The American system has a totally different current. So that's what you just said is totally correct.
Okay. Go back to the work of Leibniz, where this problem was first defined. Leibniz's major work in economic science began in Paris during the same years, 1672 to 76. He solved Kepler's plan for creating a differential calculus. His work in Paris, together with that of Christian
Huygens.
Huygens, thank you. It was done under the sponsorship of French minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The mission in which Huygens and Leibniz were involved then was to design what became known as the Industrial Revolution. Leibniz defined this task as study of the principles of the use of heat-powered machinery, by means of which one man can do the work of 100. This involved the principles of design of heat-powered machinery. Huygens worked, for example, upon what became known later as the piston-powered internal combustion engine. Leibniz's work led him to collaborate with Denis Papin in the creation of what became the first steam engine successfully used to power a boat using internal combustion. External combustion. The general problem at the center of Leibniz's work in economics was to define the way in which increasing the amount of coal-burning power supplied to a machine would increase the productive power of the operator of the machine. It is generally true that increasing the power used per operative will make possible increases of productivity, of the productivity of the operative. It is also true that by raising the operating temperature of the process, we can not only increase the productivity of the operative, but can perform kinds of work which are impossible to accomplish economically at lower temperatures. However, Leibniz's work took him beyond these problems. I shall describe the deeper problem in the simplest possible terms of illustration. Imagine that two machines use up the same amount of heat per hour, and that both are used to do the same kind of work, but that the same operative using one machine will produce more than the other machine. Assuming that both machines are well built according to their design, how shall we define the difference between these two machines? Leibniz called this difference technology. By technology, we mean, broadly speaking, the quality of organization of the machine's design. One of the simplest examples of this notion of organization is the use of a sharper, harder point, or cutting edge on a tool. The same work can be done with less effort and usually better. We develop a more general notion of organization by defining all machine functions in terms of rotary motion. What we desire to know in some principle of organization of machine design, which enables us to predict what kinds of changes in internal organization of the machine represent a more effective way of converting heat power into increased productivity of the machine's operative. This principle permits us to measure the superior organization of one machine over another. This measurement is the measure of quantity called technology. To keep the discussion as short as possible, let us define rotary motion in terms of what Leibniz defined as physical least action. Most of the preliminary work on defining principles of technology was undertaken by Lazare Carnot and Gaspard Monod, Monge circles at France's École Polytechnique, with the fundamental work established during the years 1794 to 1815, before École began to decay under the post-1815 leadership of Laplace and
Cauchy.
Cauchy. Most of the basic principles of technology are design of heat-powered mechanical devices was solved by the École during that period or soon after. The collaborators of Carnot and Monge went further to begin to define some of the problems of electrodynamics. in particular, as well as thermodynamics in general. The works of Sadi Carnot, Fourier, and
Legendre.
Legendre is the most important. However, as French scientists were repressed under the regime of Cauchy, the world's leadership in scientific progress began to shift into Prussia as early as the 1820s, with one center at Berlin under the leadership of Alexander von Humboldt, and another around Gauss at Göttingen. During the 1820s, Gauss and his collaborators, Weber, Weber undertook comprehensive reworking of electrodynamics. During the 1850s, the work on electrodynamics accelerated, centered in the collaboration between Riemann and Weber. As briefly as possible now, there is a grave flaw of inaccuracy in Fourier analysis. The combined work of Gauss, Weber,
Dirichlet,
Riemann, Wiener-Strauss, and
Weierstrass,
and Cantor were focused upon the problem of Fourier analysis to a large degree. Gauss's complex domain provided a unique basis for correcting this flaw. A more advanced view of hydrodynamics was integrated with electrodynamics. This view permits us to do for the technology of electrodynamics, which École Polytechnique did for the technology of mechanics and simpler thermodynamics.
Okay, just quick. Do you know what Fourier analysis is? It's basically taking anytime you have a system with multiple frequencies embedded within it, even like a light bulb or music as well. It could be anything. There's different frequencies that come out of light, right? Within the electromagnetic spectrum, you have the visible light, but you have other forms of light, heat as well, at different frequencies and different wavelengths. And in a musical piece, you got so many different sounds coming at you, right? A lot of it is changing. So what Fourier discovered and some of the people around this grouping was that there are ways of finding ways of pulling out basic sine waves from a complex system. You can represent a complex system by its elementary sine wave parts. Of course, that's limited because the whole is not the sum of its parts either, right? Which is why today people try to reconstruct a Bach piece using these sine waves, like adding sine waves together, and they never get anywhere. They fail every time, but they're still trying to do it. But it's still very useful to be able to look at any system with all of its complex parts and be able to appreciate the individual elements within the parts by looking at them from the standpoint of wave functions. And somehow this has application in considering electrodynamics, which I don't fully understand.
All right. So the key clue is to base a notion of physical least action on multiply connected self-similar spiral action, rather than upon multiply connected circular action. This approach permits us today to subsume modern plasma physics and coherent electromagnetic pulses under Leibniz's notion of technology. In the conclusion of this article, I shall indicate the major practical importance of that fact for organizing a long-term U.S. economic recovery today. All other things being equal, there are three conditions which must be met to generate a generalized advance in productivity for operatives. 1. The amount of usable energy supplied, both per capita and per square kilometer, must increase. 2. What is sometimes termed the effective energy flux density of the energy supplied and applied must increase. 3. The level of technology and internal organization process of production must be advanced. These three conditions are interdependent. If these conditions are not met, productivity of production will tend to stagnate and ultimately will collapse. One other point must be added now before turning to the problem of proper measurement of productivity itself. The fact that we can represent technological progress mathematically means that we can represent this in tens of the kinds of mental processes.
I'm sure you meant to say in terms of the kind of mental process.
Oh, in terms. All these terms were being thrown about. I didn't know if that was another technical one. This in terms. All right. This in terms of the kinds of mental processes which generate these discoveries. This does not explain everything about the human mind, but it describes what mental processes must do to discover a scientific advance beyond existing levels of technology. To this degree, creativity is rendered intelligible. To choose what to measure as increase of productivity takes us back to the illustration given at the beginning of this section. What determines whether a change is for the better of society or not? The answer should be obvious. Most simply, whatever increases the potential population density of society, whatever increases the number of persons who can be sustained in an improved standard of living and culture per square kilometer of land area. We consider the problem of making such measurements at several successive levels of sophistication. Since our definition of increased productivity must correspond to increase of potential population density, we should not measure output in either prices or particular products. We measure output in terms of market baskets of consumers' and producers' requirements. The number and qualities of products in market baskets changes with technological progress. Labor of a higher quality of productivity requires a higher standard of living to maintain its household at that level of cultural potential. So we must measure how many individual market baskets worth of output are produced by the labor of a single operative. We must take into account both consumers' market basket requirements and producers' requirements measured in the same way. The problem of diminishing returns on natural resources comes into play. Here, energy comes directly into play. More energy per capita, and the greater the effective energy flux density of that energy, the poor quality of natural resources we can use without suffering an increase in cost of production. As we are able to use poorer natural resources economically, the limits of natural resources are widened, whereas if we do not advance technologically, the limits of natural resources close in upon us.
So far, does anybody have any question, or are people generally following the basic idea pretty well?
I think so.
Okay.
All right. If we are broadening the limits of natural resources, the result is that an average square kilometer of land will sustain an increasing number of people. If our technological progress is stagnant, the limits of natural resources are closing in upon us. If we skip backward technologically and have less energy used in production per capita and per square kilometer, the society is on the road to collapse. For these reasons, it is not adequate to measure productivity in terms of present-day market baskets. What we must measure is a rate of increase of productivity, a rate which must be high enough so that we are broadening the limits of natural resources rather than allowing them to close in upon us.
Okay. All right.
Very interesting. Huh?
Yeah.
I was thinking, when we see what's going on with the farming nowadays, all this question of reducing the input of fertilizer in the processes of farming. I mean, this is exactly what the farm and Matthew and I, we watched a video that was made by this Canadian farmer. It's pretty funny, but he was making the point that farmers are it's not just a lifestyle. It's not just like it's cool to be a farmer, that's what we want to do, but it's a business. It's something that is vital for society, but it's also something that people do and they want to have good returns on. So right now, the policies that are being implemented for so-called green, reasons, it goes totally against this principle that LaRouche just, elaborated in this paper so far. Like, how do you increase the rate of production, increase the rate of productivity? That's you need to use the best you have. You don't go backwards. That's not gonna work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the idea of increasing the efficiency per producer in society, instead of, because right now we're in a world where everyone is really obsessed with pricing. Like, what's a science of pricing? And you've got Keynes, who's got his theories, and von Hayek in the Austrian school have their theories of pricing. And it goes on and on forever to listen to these debates. And they're all ignoring some basic elementary qualities, like, is your society getting worse or getting better? Like, are you overall losing the ability to sustain life while you're debating on whether or not to price heroin or not, or like, are you did you maintain your basic infrastructure? Is your overall food production decreasing while your monetary flows are increasing in a stupid way? Because they tend to ignore these basic things that they should be looking at primarily. And what LaRouche is getting at is he's saying, like, no, just don't stress about pricing. Look first and foremost at, is your society as a whole and getting better, and are individual producers within it increasing their productivity or not? Is it decreasing? Because if their power of production individually is increasing, it means that you're able to use lower quality resources because you have better technologies that can use things that a former system without those advanced technologies would have to call useless, like oil, which is more contaminated, or there's so many things. Or just make new resources by making a completely new discovery, like what we've been able to do by tapping into the atom. That would do it. Yeah.
But that's, once again, the aristocratic mentality versus the plutocratic mentality. And I would say that Jacques Attali told a story about Jacques Attali. For those who don't know him, is a French intellectual and a politician. He told us a quite amusing story showing the plutocratic mentality. Okay, so he said there was a merchant A and a merchant B, and the merchant A managed to sell a certain amount of pans to merchant B, and merchant B discovered, amazed and completely flabbergasted, that the pans only have one leg. Okay, so he called back his colleague merchant A, but you are crook. You sold me pans with one leg. Who is going to buy those pans? So merchant A answered in a very plutocratic manner, but you don't understand. It's only for sell and buy. You don't need working pans, okay? It's only that I sold them to you, you bought them to me, and you just sell them to any idiots that would be willing to buy those pans. Just invent something to sell those pans. So that is precisely the obsession on pricing and not on productivity and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, in terms of creativity and productivity, do you know the civilizational scale by Nikolai Kardashev?
Nope.
Okay, Nikolai Kardashev was a Soviet scientist, and he defined, we're not even at civilization type 1, okay? He defined civilization type 1, 2, 3, 4. And the civilization type 1 is the civilization capable to harness all the energy of the closest star, okay? In our case, it would be the sun. And we're not yet capable to harvest all the energy from our sun. And civilization 4, the highest, would be the civilization capable to harness the energy of all the universe. So it's a theory, or it's a storytelling which is much more focused on creativity, the aristocratic mentality, rather than selling the plutocratic mentality.
Well, he definitely sets a very high bar. It's
Wow.
a long way to go.
We're not even at civilization 1.
Yeah. No, I like setting a high bar. It's you can only hit the moon if you reach for the stars.
Yeah, exactly. So better in that sense, I rather tend to dismiss identifying people as good or evil. But I would say that in this case, it's much better to follow people like Nikolai Kardashev than to follow people like Jacques Attali.
Jacques Attali is very problematic, yes.
Yes.
Made some very questionable decisions.
I have a question on this point that Kwan just brought up about price discovery. So the from my perspective, when I'm looking at this, the overemphasis on price discovery and the pricing mechanism to commerce and economy, it does overshadow productivity. But the metrics used today, GDP, is all about price discovery and quantitative in terms of currency, not actual production of goods or services that benefit society long term, like excessive financialization of the in the West here versus maybe the East, where you have more production in terms of physical commodities being made. If we have to move away from this obsession over prices, what kind of system, or how do we look at building a system based on measuring actual production and its both short-term and long-term benefits to society?
Well, the short answer is political economic. And the key word is political. As you said, Jonathan, we define wealth by the GDP and other measurements, but it is because the people having power decided that those numbers have a certain value, okay, rather than the well-being of the people or the productivity or the creativity, or using Kardashev scale, civilization 0.23 maybe, I don't know. So you need political economy in the sense that you need statement and not politician statement who are aristocratic men who will decide that the type of measurement of indices that will be used will reflect the well-being of the people or the productivity and not the fantasies of a plutocratic class. So it has to be enforced. And if you need that to be enforced, you need a government with the power of the army, of the police, and of the law to impose that. So that's why, in 2 words, political economy.
Yeah, but in the same measure too, like in the case of like the American system, is that it involves the aspiration to unite sort of the best of all worlds. Because the American system is uniquely premised around the idea of actualizing the sacredness of the individual and the right for personal liberty, as contained in the Declaration of Independence, while at the same time actualizing the general welfare clause of the preamble of the Constitution, that the good is contained in the welfare of the whole. So the dichotomy one gets from the British, the idea of Adam Smith capitalism versus communism, where one doesn't really care about the whole and just cares about the freedom of the individual to do whatever they want, while the other one tends to not care about the individual and cares only about the whole. That type of dichotomization is not something, it's dealt with in a very creative way in the system of Henry C. Carey, Hamilton, this whole current that we've been discussing, because you still have to have, like, pricing will still be a factor, having free enterprise. It's not like just this totalitarian system of just like scientific management of society in a utilitarian way. It wouldn't just be that either.
Exactly.
Though there would be scientific principles that you would have embedded in your school system when people, by the time you graduate high school, you learn basic fundamental principles of what maintains a human society well, such that your economists are going to have a much better foundation, and your political figures will have a much better foundation than we do today, which most people are just ignorant to those basic principles of, the health of human systems.
Exactly. But once again, we can go back to the genealogy of communism. Okay, it's for sure that the traditional society at the end of the 18th and 19th century were not societies promoting equality and education for all. So there have been a certain revolts of the people against the own elite. But does it mean that everything that has been invented in the past, the epistemology, the meritocratic system, and so on, could be also useful nowadays? Okay, so I would say that once again, a good system is a system in which everyone at different epistemological level have the capacity to live his epistemological level, meaning that even in the ideal society, I would hypothesize that there would be more plutocratic men than aristocratic men. But those plutocratic men have to be allowed to live their epistemological level, but ideally, they should not be allowed to take control of the society because they are not at the highest epistemological development.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's where I think you need, the big fight that people often overlook or they don't appreciate enough is the cultural fight and educational. Whereas, if you actually have a proper approach to training the young in a proper appreciation for the truths that gave birth to the good of our history, all of those leaps towards improvement, it would have an ennobling character. People wouldn't want to, they would have such a respect for themselves that they wouldn't even want to do those hedonistic, foolish things that might be momentarily, seductive and pleasurable for the senses, but that ultimately hurt or disrupt your ability to tap into your creative soul, the best part of yourself. It disrupts that. So people wouldn't even want to do those things that today are so attractive and seductive, which pervert and corrupt the mind into all sorts of stupidity. But that's it's always sort of a handicap before it could blossom. We had moments of this around Alexander von Humboldt, and we've had moments in history in different parts of the world where it worked for a bit, but it was never permitted to not be sabotaged before it could really blossom in a higher way to take a hold.
Yes, and that's my pretension about an analysis of universal history. Okay, in the sense that you cannot force everyone to be aristocratic man at a certain point in human evolution. Okay, But those who are at the helm, who are governing, must be aristocratic men. The rest of the population, as you said, will be inspired to a certain extent. At least they won't be capable to harm because they are not at the helm in the government. The problem nowadays is precisely because the plutocratic class, which is not at the highest epistemological development, is at the helm of the government. And because of it, you don't have the possibility for aristocratic men to be at position of powers and influence so that it could be a better society. And it doesn't mean that those plutocratic men don't have the right to live or to incarnate their tendencies. I think nothing should be forbidden, but they cannot be at the top of the society.
Well, who was it? I think it was Thomas More in his Utopia, but I think Leibniz also said something to this effect, that you generally don't want to have, like, the role of a butcher in society who's like killing the animals and cutting up their meat. It's a useful job to have, but you don't want to, you know, it's a tough thing. And if somebody has been caught with predilections towards criminality, murder or something, make them do that kind of like work and get their become useful cutting up cows and stuff instead of letting them like run society. But don't let them go beyond that. I don't know if he was being playful. He might have been. I think he was being playful. But either way, I think the point is that, yeah, there should be a role to play that is ultimately positive for everyone. And even like, oh yeah, that was it. Leibniz did say that even the criminal, like the severe criminal, he was not really for the death penalty, but he was like, you know, you should put you can make them work in a mine instead of killing them, so that they're at least going to be productive, and maybe at night they can read books, or you can encourage them to try to discover their mind's power, so that at the very least they're doing work that's useful for society instead of just like eliminating this being, which
absolutely. Okay, but once again, just to prevent the plutocratic man to get power, it's only a small thing. It's a minuscule thing. Okay, but just that, it would make a big difference.
yes.
Just that. Okay, I'm not even talking of utopia.
Yeah.
It would be 1/5 of utopia.
By the way, earlier on, there was a discussion that LaRouche was bringing up, this question of, I think it's here. Oh yeah. When you're dealing with self-similar spiral functions that have a conic quality, there's several aspects to that, but you know, you could think about the idea of inside of a circle. If you grow something at a certain growth rate, you know, inside of a circle, you can create, in this case, I think this curvature is being defined as as being shaped by the golden section, the Fibonacci sequence of growth. But that's just like a linear two-dimensional expression of it. But if you think about it from the standpoint of something growing, you could imagine that curvature, if you think about this on a timeline where this vertical axis would be the time function, where this circle, this cross-section of a cone, increases to this point from A to B, and it's rotating at the same time. So if you imagine a spot on the circumference of this small circle rotating on the surface of the cone as it's moving and growing to point B, you can imagine a spiral, right, moving around the circumference of the cone. And there's a really fun video which has one expression of that in physical reality as we find it. Have you guys seen this video of the solar system? It's really nice because people often get this sort of two-dimensional expression of our solar system with these ellipses, you know, around a sun. This video, and there's a bunch like this, they show you a different, what's actually happening, or something a little bit more realistic, because the sun is also moving. And the sun's not just moving straight, it's moving around a galactic center within a galaxy, right? So you have this process going where it's also at an angle. It's at an angle according to the plane of the Milky Way, and you have this actual function occurring of these different planets. That's the wider part of the solar system, right? Moving around. As the sun itself is also moving. So the sort of real action that we're moving in time, as we're rotating 30,000 or whatever it is miles per hour and rotating even faster, you're actually tracing out that sort of pathway, right? And take it a step back amongst the billions of other stars within our particular galaxy. You've got something which is, and I mean, there's some deduction happening here, but we have every 33 million year of bobbing period, you're bobbing above and below the plane of the Milky Way, which as a whole revolves around the center every 230 million years, approximately. I mean, so you've got a higher geometry, like in terms of like, what is this non-Euclidean geometry, which is one accessible way of thinking about it, is just that one simple representation. It gets even more rich the more you look at it, but that's one really nice way of getting at it. So this is an idea that LaRouche really he saw a high value in this idea of cross sections as being something that can create a language to help us understand what's really happening in economic systems. And we're going to see more and more of this as we go deeper and deeper and deeper into LaRouche's science of physical economy, is the use of conic sections, harmonics within these conic sections, the golden section, and also least action pathways. Since, right, like every orbit of a planet around the sun is moving in what you might consider it's not just an ellipse, but it's really least action pathways. Of all possible pathways that our orbits find themselves in, we have not anything, but we have specific harmonic arrangements with least action. You get the most effect with the least amount of effort in each of these orbits, which is again another property we would want to try to attain in organizing human economies too. Since what do you invest in, right? You got a choice to invest. You got a limited amount of income that you have to be able to invest in building projects for the future. And you have this option for this bridge, this high-speed rail, this scientific innovation that hasn't been made yet. Where do you deploy your resources to get a certain effect? What type of pathways into the future do we put because you can't do everything all at once. There's still a certain time function that we have to abide by. So these ideas are also going to be useful in that regard as well. So it's 10 o'clock. There's a bunch of stuff that Pascal and Declan also shared an interesting video of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which I just saved. I'm looking forward to watching that tonight. Pascal shared a bunch of stuff. And I highly recommend the last link. I'd recommend everybody go into the chat box and save the very last YouTube video called Lyndon LaRouche, The Power of Labor. It's a 2-hour video from 1984. Very high value production. Little corny in terms of the production process, but the idea content is fantastic. So check that out, and then we'll meet up and finish this paper next week. Okay, guys?
All right.
Awesome.
Very good. Very nice.
Very good. Very nice.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.